second to say, we are here today, of course, on the 50th anniversary of something momentous in our country. I speak, of course, of the untimely demise of Reverend Martin Luther King. And it's important, I think, as we remember someone who was as influential in our nation's history as Dr. King, to remember, of course, that he or anyone could not do it alone. That when we speak of the accomplishments of someone who was transcendent in their own times, we should remember that they, of course, were aided by countless hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people whom history has, I wouldn't say largely forgotten, but at least grouped together. Speak, of course, of the great numbers of people who worked together in order to achieve all the accomplishments that someone like Dr. King did. And when I think back on the history of the accomplishments that have occurred over the course of the evolution of civil rights in this country in particular, the place I think we have to start leads us to today. It leads us to Abraham Lincoln, who, of course, as you know, played a significant role in the evolution of our country's conception of race and citizenship and, frankly, of itself. Now, tonight we're not necessarily going to be talking about those issues per se, but rather about Lincoln's foreign policy. But this is all by way of introduction for our speaker tonight, who, of course, has made me entirely rethink my appreciation of President Lincoln. Because as a professional historian, when someone used to say, will you please rank the presidents, you were supposed to always have Washington, Lincoln, and Roosevelt, and then a discussion of the others. I have dropped Lincoln considerably down the list because he stole my best friend. And that would be Alan Lowe, who, of course, used to be here as director of the George W. Bush Library. He previously had worked at the FDR Library, at the Reagan Art Library, at the National Archives Home Office, if you will. And then, of course, he was taken away from us to Springfield, Illinois, to represent a man who I think, frankly, we all appreciate. And it was a great joy to have someone who we all appreciate come back to tell us about a man we all appreciate. Alan Lowe.
Thank you all. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. It is absolutely wonderful to be here this evening. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to see so many friends in the audience. I loved my time here at the Bush Library Museum. It was an incredible experience that Kathy, Carolyn, and I will always treasure. I think we accomplished a lot at the Bush Library. I think we made a real difference, and I made friends who mean the world to me, including Dr. Engel. SMU was always a terrific partner, too. I was constantly impressed with this place. My daughter took the prospective student tour this morning. I appreciated it even more. And especially, I was always impressed with Jeff and his crew at the Center for Presidential History. The work they do, really an amazing team. I want to thank Ronna Spitz for all her help in getting me here tonight and taking care of innumerable details for me, so thank you. You know, as many of you know, I also taught every year at Taos with Jeff at the SMU's Cultural Institute. And we had a great time with tremendous, very engaged students, often with his wonderful parents who are here tonight. And I love debating Jeff, especially about the greatness of Reagan. Jeff is a tough debater, very smart guy, but luckily I had truth on my side in that debate. And so that was fairly easy. If you have not read Jeff's new book, When the World Seemed New, buy it right away. As of yet, I'm not getting any kickback for saying that. I'm going to talk to him, but it was really an amazing work, so Jeff should be very proud. Most importantly, Jeff was a true and good friend and remains that. So thank you, Jeff. He recently came to Springfield, by the way, and spoke for us, and we had a great time there. So I miss Dallas, I miss SMU, I miss all my Bush Library and Bush Foundation friends. But Illinois has a lot to offer. Let me make sure this PowerPoint works. I've learned a lot about Illinois in the almost 2 years since I've been there. It's the Illinois Bicentennial, by the way, this year, 2018. I've been honored to serve on the Illinois Bicentennial Commission, helping plan events around the state. If you haven't visited, come on up. Of course, we have the city of Chicago, amazing museums and restaurants and sites there. The towns along Route 66. So many great things to do, some awesome parks. You see in the lower right, Shawnee Hills State Park, which is in the southern part of the state. So a lot of great things to do throughout Illinois. And of course, if you come to Springfield, in addition to the Abraham Lincoln Library Museum, which I will tell you a lot about, we also have the Lincoln Home, which is administered by the National Park Service, the Lincoln Tomb, the old state capitol, which is absolutely gorgeous. That's where Lincoln gave his House Divided speech in 1858. They also recreated the village of New Salem, just north of Springfield, where Lincoln first struck out on his own. You can go up and see New Salem. And all of us Lincoln sites in Illinois joined together in what's called the Lincoln National Heritage Area. So you can go around to where, for example, he had the Lincoln-Douglas debates, or where he would practice law in various courthouses. So a lot of things to do all around Illinois, and particularly in Springfield. Now, my institution, the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. Now, sometimes tonight you will hear me say ALPLM. We love acronyms. I will fall into that, I guarantee you. That's the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. It's a fairly new institution. It was established in 2005, and we are a state agency in Illinois, so we're an independent state agency in the state of Illinois, and that was one of my priorities when I got there, was to get that standalone agency status. So I worked with the governor and the legislature and learned a lot about Illinois politics along the way. But I did get that accomplished, thankfully, with a lot of help from a lot of people. Our job at the library is to preserve and perpetuate the legacy of Abraham Lincoln and of the state of Illinois. Our permanent exhibits, as you will see, oh, I'm sorry, I missed a slide. Well, okay, there's no permanent exhibit slide. There you go. Our permanent exhibits are broken into two big sections. Journey 1 and Journey 2. The first journey starts with Abraham Lincoln as a young man, his trip to Indiana as a young boy from Kentucky, then over to Illinois, then through his evolution, his moving to New Salem, his meeting Mary Todd and their marriage, his beginning life as a lawyer, as a Whig politician, working his way up the ranks. And we end that first journey in 1860 with his election to the White House. The second journey begins with him coming into office, a nation falling apart around him. Fort Sumter, the beginning of the war. You see his evolution as a president and the growing issue of emancipation, the Emancipation Proclamation, the progress of the war, all of it leading up, of course, to the victory in war, but then his assassination. And we talk about that horrible night in Washington. And we really talk about his ideas, his sacrifice, his determination, how at the end of the day, Abraham Lincoln saved the Union and gave us all a new birth of freedom. We have some wonderful shows that complement that exhibit. One's called Ghost of the Library, where we talk about why presidential libraries are important, using really impressive technology. And then we also have Eyes of Lincoln, so we tell his life story, again, using some really neat immersive technology in those programs. Now, our special exhibits, we have at least one major special exhibit every year, plus a holiday exhibit. They're pretty amazing. We just opened our bicentennial exhibit, which is called From Illinois to the White House, Lincoln, Grant, Reagan, Obama. All about those four men with deep Illinois roots who have helped lead our country. And here you see in the upper left, that's Governor Bruce Rauner, my boss, came to the opening of the exhibit. And we have some really neat items in this. It's open through the rest of this bicentennial year. We have, for example, the note cards that President Reagan used when he said, "Tear down this wall" in Berlin. We have the Appomattox surrender table. We have Grant's saddle that he used at the end of the war. I believe in the lower left there you have the original 1818 Constitution of the state of Illinois. We have President Obama loaned us one of his Grammy Awards. Pretty cool. And the first actually 3D printed bust of a president, that was President Obama. He sat for that rather than a life mask like they used to do. This was through a 3D printer. Pretty cool, and the Smithsonian loaned that to us. So come up and see us anytime, but I would especially say come up this year, because this is one really, really interesting exhibit, and we're getting a great, great response to it. Of course, our library is terrific, too. We have the world's largest collection of Abraham Lincoln artifacts and documents. And here you see some of our most iconic items. At the top, you see one of the 3 hats we know that still survive that he wore. This is an early hat. It's made of beaver skin, so we think he used it when he was riding the circuit as a lawyer in Illinois. You see those imprints on there? Those are from where he would doff his hat, or those out over time, doffing his hat. The gloves are a sadder story. Those are the gloves that were in his pocket the night he was assassinated. They have his blood on them. The thing is, back then it was customary to wear gloves to events like that, and he hated doing it. And Mary would get very mad at him and always give him gloves to wear, and he inevitably would stick them in his pocket rather than putting them on. And that's where they were the night he was assassinated. In the lower part of the slide, you see some of our most impressive documents. We have a handwritten copy of the Gettysburg Address, written by Abraham Lincoln. We have a 13th Amendment signed by Lincoln and all members of Congress who voted for it, and a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation signed by President Lincoln. We have thousands of other documents. It is truly amazing. We have, for example, the oldest known piece of writing by Abraham Lincoln when he was a child in Indiana practicing his mathematics. And we have that. We have Mary's music box. It goes on and on. Every time I go to our stacks, I see something new. You know, this group tried to steal Lincoln's body at one point. Have you heard that story? That's a few years after they were going to hold his body for ransom to try to get somebody out of jail. They didn't succeed, thankfully. They were kind of idiots, but they didn't. And they were caught in the act, and they confiscated the tools they were using, and we have those tools. So, you know, I didn't know that until the other day. They opened the drawer, and there they were. So my staff did, but I didn't. So we have an amazing library, an amazing set of Lincoln-related documents. We also have a documentary editing project called The Papers of Abraham Lincoln that very soon will start putting out digital annotated copies of every document written to and by Abraham Lincoln. And that's a long time coming, but this year that will go live with our beta version of our website, and it's going to be, I think, a great resource for students and scholars everywhere. But in addition to all these Lincoln things, we're also the Illinois State Historical Library. It goes back, it has a history back to 1889. So when you go in our storage area, you see 8 miles worth of shelving. And some of that's Lincoln, but a lot of it is this Illinois collections relating to the whole life of the Prairie State. We have an oral history program that's now 10 years old. We have a conservation lab. The state historian of Illinois is a member of my staff. So we really do a lot of varied things related to both Lincoln and Illinois. As with the other presidential libraries, like our wonderful Bush Library here, we do a ton in education and public programs as well. Teacher workshops, we create curriculum, have a very active series of speakers. Talmadge Boston came up to speak for us, Jeff Engel. We keep a very active series, but also work a lot with teachers around the region, around the state, including we help lead History Day for the whole state of Illinois, so we stay very busy. There you see in the upper left-hand part, we have a thing called Pets in the White House, which is a fun thing for our citizens of Springfield to bring their dogs down. We have a park as part of our property. My dogs, Lincoln and Rex, were grand marshals of the parade the first year we were there. They had no idea what was going on, but I was very, very proud of them. So that, very quickly, is what we do up in Springfield. I hope you will come visit us soon and often. It is a wonderful place, and I'd absolutely love to see you up there. Now, I often say at the Lincoln Library Museum that we live every day in the world of Abraham Lincoln. But I would add, without any reservation, that each and every one of you do the same. Lincoln's impact on the nation and the world is continuing today in the 21st century. How Lincoln interacted with the wider world, how that world interacted with him, and how it views him now are kind of important and often overlooked topics. His knowledge of the world, his foreign policy that we're going to talk about tonight, the international impact of his ideas, all were crucial to his success then and to his legacy today. Now, to say this would have been an unexpected line of inquiry to a young Lincoln would be a vast, vast understatement. He was born essentially into poverty. He had almost no formal education. Most betting people would have said that Lincoln would live out his life on the farm. He struck out on his own after his family moved to Illinois in 1830. After trying a few other professions, I'm sure you've heard this story, a businessman, postmaster, surveyor, he found the law and politics. And even then, he still experienced failures and often expressed the fear that he would have no lasting impact on the world around him. This intelligent, driven, very ambitious man threw himself into the political arena. But several times, after his one term in the U.S. House, after losses in 2 elections for the U.S. Senate, he thought he was finished politically and said as much. But he persevered, and we know that he entered the White House in 1861 in the midst of the gravest crisis our nation has ever faced. As a new president facing the secession of the South and the beginnings of the war, he bemoaned his general lack of knowledge of foreign affairs. He said to one associate upon entering office that he thought he should perhaps study up on foreign policy. He'd never left the United States, he never would. He supposedly was heard to tell his Secretary of State, William Seward, that he would be relying on him for foreign policy knowledge because he personally had none. Though that was an overstatement, and one that's kind of suspiciously played well into Seward's hands, Still, I think it was genuinely accurate and not exactly a recipe for success. Certainly, if you compared Lincoln to Seward, who had experience in the Senate with foreign affairs and who traveled widely, Lincoln was a rank amateur in diplomacy. But despite all that, at the end of the day, President Lincoln skillfully navigated the dangerous world of foreign affairs and in the end not only saved our nation, but became an international inspiration for everyone committed to democracy and equality and justice. And for that, he is venerated today by millions around the globe. Now let's take a step back and look at the first time as a national leader that Abraham Lincoln took a stand on foreign policy. During his one term in the U.S. Congress, Lincoln took a very strong stance against the war with Mexico. I know we had Amy Greenberg here speaking about that when I was here as director. The war had started just 10 days after Lincoln's nomination for the congressional seat, and at first he appeared to support it. He assured his constituents before leaving Illinois, saying, "Foreign nations will find Americans acting as one man with one soul." But quickly his views evolved. They changed. On the way to Washington, he and Mary stopped in her hometown and our hometown of Lexington, Kentucky, where they heard a very impassioned speech by Lincoln's idol, Henry Clay, against the war. Clay had lost a son at the Battle of Buena Vista, which had hardened an opposition he was already helping to lead against the war. Clay and Lincoln's Whigs, though, walked a very fine line. They feared the consequences of what they thought, frankly, was a trumped-up war that would only serve to increase the power of the presidency, and that they both knew would throw wide open the whole question of the expansion of slavery. At the same time, the war was popular, and opposition to it was seen as treasonous. Still, once in Washington, Lincoln made his opposition to President Polk and the war very well known, much to the chagrin of Herndon and his other supporters in Illinois who believed he was committing political suicide. As a freshman congressman, Lincoln argued loudly that the war was both unnecessary and unconstitutional. He voted to support the troops, but would not relent in his attack on the president, demanding to know the exact spot where supposedly Mexican troops had attacked the American troops. These spot resolutions, as they became known, led to Lincoln acquiring a nickname from his detractors. They called him Spotty. That was his nickname. Herndon was right in that Lincoln's Illinois constituents wondered what in the world he was doing. In taking this position, Lincoln made a lot of enemies, but he also made some friends, including, for example, Senator Tom Corwin, who was an outspoken critic of the war, becoming friends with Lincoln, and who Lincoln later, as president, appointed Corwin as his minister to Mexico. Now, ultimately, Lincoln did not run for Congress again after his one term. That was the plan anyway. He was making room, he thought, for another Whig to come into that position. But his successor was a Democrat, and Lincoln thought his political days were over. He was deeply bruised. In his trademark humor, he later remarked, quote, "I opposed one war. That was enough for me. I'm now perpetually in favor of war, pestilence, and famine." Unquote. Now, it's interesting looking back at this first foreign policy stance of Lincoln to see some continuity with his later approach. Scholars have pointed out that he already was combining somewhat contradictory elements in American foreign policy doctrine. He was an idealist in many ways, standing firm on principle, but he also was a realist, a pragmatist, who opposed the war but voted to support the troops, and who later supported the war hero, Zachary Taylor, as the Whig presidential candidate in the election of 1848. So now, though, let's go and look at some of the nuts and bolts of Lincoln's foreign policy as president. Now, obviously, most of Lincoln's attention during his too brief tenure in office was paid to preserving the Union and addressing, ultimately, the issue of emancipation. But he was also amazingly active on domestic issues. This is something I've learned, frankly, since I became director. He supported things like the Transcontinental Railroad. He chartered the National Academy of Sciences. He reformed our entire banking system. So all these things going on while he's fighting the war. Truly an amazing man. But he also, of course, had to deal with a variety of foreign policy issues. Some were directly Civil War related. Some only happened within that context. So as an example of the latter, Spain took advantage of the moment and re-annexed Santo Domingo, the present-day Dominican Republic, a direct violation of the Monroe Doctrine, but one we were powerless to do anything about at that time. Of course, other foreign policy issues were directly related to the conduct of the war and ultimately to the preservation of our nation. If any major European power had recognized and supported the Confederacy, most likely the war would have ended with Southern independence. This was a constant fear for Lincoln and for his ambassadors. Now, just appointing ambassadors was a challenge. Remember, Lincoln was a relative unknown, representing a party that was very new. 1860 election was only the second presidential election since the Republican Party had been founded. Finding qualified men to fill important ambassadorial posts was not easy, especially when you factor in Lincoln's need to consider their thoughts on the war, on slavery, and the states or factions they represented, much like the calculus he went through in creating his cabinet. In the end, the characters were colorful, eccentric, often bombastic, I would say, but ultimately greatly successful. Lincoln's choices and his directions to them through Seward helped save the Union. As I noted earlier, Lincoln had appointed Tom Corwin to the post of Minister of Mexico, a very good choice, and symbolic of Lincoln's reversal of our aggressive attitudes toward our southern neighbors. In England, he appointed Charles Francis Adams, son of John Quincy, grandson of John and Abigail Adams, real American royalty. The choice was inspired. Adams was the most important of all such appointments, and the end performed really well. In France, also an important posting, he named William Dayton as minister to the French court, not as well known, but ultimately an excellent choice, along with our counsel there, John Bigelow. My favorite appointment, perhaps, was the great Kentucky abolitionist, Cassius Clay. Originally slated for Spain, he said no thank you, and ended up in Russia. If you don't know much about Cassius, I encourage you to read his story. He's incredibly brave. He fought slavery with passion and a big amount of wildness, I would say. When he finally got to Russia, he constantly picked duels and was always stirring the pot, and the Russians loved him. He left briefly that post, came back. Simon Cameron was there for a while, but then Clay went back to Russia, working with a country that in many ways helped the Union, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. The South, of course, also immediately sent envoys to Europe. William Yancey, A. Dudley Mann, Pierre Rost. Depending on their audience, these Southern envoys and their sympathizers tried to paint theirs as a war for independence from tyranny, as a war to preserve an aristocratic conservative world, as a war against the North's high tariff that destroyed Southern trade with England and the rest of Europe. They painted the North as radical Democrats, as murderous monsters, as cold-hearted industrialists. Now, at the end of the day, the actions of Great Britain were those that mattered the most to North and South. As the war started, Queen Victoria had warned her citizens not to pick sides and not to provide munitions to either side. Our Foreign Service saw this as perhaps the first step toward a formal recognition of the Confederacy. English factories depended on Southern cotton. Jefferson Davis and his envoys were confident that the pressure from more and more unemployed factory workers would ultimately bring British recognition and perhaps even intervention. And though we were big trading partners with Britain, the old hatreds between the former colonies and the former mother country still ran really deep, with many, especially in the English ruling classes, hoping for the failure of American republicanism. Confederates lost no opportunity of telling the English that the North was not only not a friend of England, but a rival that was growing more powerful over time. The opinion of Lincoln was very low in Britain at the beginning. The British minister in Washington, Lord Lyons, said early on that, quote, Lincoln has not given proof of possessing any natural talents to compensate for his ignorance of everything but Illinois village politics, unquote. Not a great first impression, I guess. The London Times correspondent, William Russell, was a very powerful voice in Britain. Lincoln once said of Russell and his paper, quote, the London Times is one of the greatest powers in the world. In fact, I don't know anything which has more power except perhaps the Mississippi River, unquote. Russell in his reporting often supported the belief that many in the South were not fighting for independence, but for reunion with Great Britain, a country more in tune with Southern aristocratic society. He supported the general feeling that many in Europe, and especially in England, had, was that the South ultimately would indeed be victorious. But Lincoln had a real innate understanding of the press, and you see this throughout his entire political career. He was really one of the first modern politicians in that way, and he honed it throughout that entire career. It was one way he turned his disadvantages around in relation to England and the rest of Europe. He directed his representatives to connect with the press, to write articles and ask others to do the same. He also, by the way, told all of his ambassadors to report to him on the popular sentiment in the countries where they were located. and they told him much the same story. Liberals in monarchies favored the North as an example of the success of democracy. Conservatives often also would support the North out of a fear of revolution and a general revulsion towards slavery. So countries like Sweden and Italy seemed sympathetic. The German states were divided, with the middle and lower classes and commercial classes supporting the North and the landowner and military classes supporting the South. In Russia, with Tsar Alexander II, who had freed the serfs, that Tsar told Ambassador Clay that Russia and America were bound together by common sympathy in the common cause of emancipation. In Central and South America, Lincoln assured those nations of our friendship, backing away from the former bellicose attitudes, particularly of the Buchanan administration. Lincoln really established good relations there with good representatives, often sending outspoken abolitionists to those countries. To reach the British people, Lincoln and Adams used the Morning Star newspaper as well as the Daily News and the Spectator. Over time, this was a really very highly effective way of counterbalancing the efforts of the Confederates and the pressure that was being created by the stoppage of the cotton trade. The workers of northern England, in particular, were losing their jobs, but they also believed in free labor and were against slavery. In the end, belief in those ideas helped sway them and the British government toward non-intervention and non-recognition of the South. It also helped that more cotton flowed in over time from other places like India. Now, Adams also had some good British liberal friends who saw America not only as a future ally or potential ally in the future, but as a model of how to bring more representative government to Britain. Among those friends were most famously members of Parliament John Bright and Richard Cobden, who you see here. Bright's support of the U.S. was vital. When Lincoln died, by the way, among the things that were found in his pocket was a testimonial that had been written by Bright supporting Lincoln's re-election. That was very important. You know, Lincoln at one point assumed he would not win re-election. It did not look good for him at one point. Though they had never directly corresponded from what we know, they did through intermediaries, and it's evident that Lincoln and Bright had a great respect for one another. Bright's portrait hung in Lincoln's reception room in the White House. Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner was close to both Bright and Cobden and helped solidify their support of the North. Sumner's involvement in foreign policy, though, did lead to fights, of course, with Secretary of State Seward, and you see that's another story of Lincoln's tenure of constantly trying to balance out big egos and big personalities around him. But over time, both Sumner and Adams were able to work a lot with Cobden and Bright to help cement support in England for the North. Now, at the time, Palmerston was Victoria, name, she called him the immoral one, which that's pretty amazing. He had a long history as foreign minister, and in 1855 had become prime minister at the age of 70. He didn't particularly care for the United States. He saw us as a threat to power in general. And in the Civil War, he thought that Seward, who was always very bellicose toward the British, would find some way to pick a fight with them. And you must remember also, Britain at this time was a very powerful nation and a somewhat aggressive one at that. They, in recent years, had just been involved in conflicts in Russia and in India and China. Now, Palmerston and Lincoln went head-to-head in the biggest foreign policy incident of the Lincoln administration. It's called the Trent Affair. Too often, I think, when we talk about Lincoln and foreign policy, it only just involves this issue, the Trent Affair. But it was, indeed, a very dangerous crisis. Now, here are the basics. Confederate officials James Mason and John Slidell were on their way to England and France aboard a British ship called the Trent. The USS San Jacinto, captained by Charles Wilkes, stopped the Trent, boarded it, and arrested Mason and Slidell, who were then sent to a prisoner of war camp. The British screamed that this was a violation of international law and an act of war. Captain Wilkes, of course, was held as a hero by the American public, even at first by the administration. But quickly, Lincoln realized the captain had unwittingly put us in a pretty bad position. As international law stood, it appears that Wilkes had the right to search the Trent, but not the right to make an arrest on the ship. And by doing so, he'd violated the rights of a neutral nation. The British Parliament prepared for war, with Prime Minister Palmerston and his foreign minister, Lord John Russell, being very, very bellicose. Plans were drawn up to blockade America, attack our Navy, and invade. British troops were dispatched to Canada for that very purpose. Plans were drawn up to bombard and burn Boston and New York. Lincoln knew this would spell the doom of the Union. We simply could not fight the Confederates and the very powerful British. He famously said, "We could only handle one war at a time." But he was boxed in. Public opinion in the U.S., which was vital to Lincoln, particularly at a time when the war was not going well, it was decidedly in favor of keeping the two Confederates imprisoned and not backing down to the hated British. It became, in the words of one author, a transatlantic game of chicken. Seward warned Britain that if war were to erupt, we would wrap the world in flames. Lincoln used the U.S. press, though, to slowly bring the public along. He would plant articles to explain why the release of the prisoners would be appropriate. At the same time, British liberals voiced their opposition to war with the United States. And Queen Elizabeth's husband, Prince Albert, famously became involved, watering down an initially very bellicose note to the Americans that he feared would leave us with no option but war. Finally, Lincoln felt he'd reached a point with the public where he could release the envoys, which he did. He disavowed their actions, but he didn't make a formal apology, and it diffused the crisis. Both sides seemed somewhat relieved that war had not broken out, or very relieved, but that was not the end of our British problems throughout the Civil War. Rumors of war continued, and issues with the blockade and the seizure of ships by our Navy kept providing flashpoints. The Confederate ship Alabama famously left its British port to prey on Union shipping. There were raids by Confederates who were hiding in Canada into Ohio and Vermont, and that enraged Lincoln and Seward. They threatened to abrogate the U.S.-English Treaty of 1817, which had made the U.S.-Canada border non-fortified. They said they would fortify the border and the lakes along it if this kept up. On several occasions, Lincoln and our supporters in England almost gave up hope, as conservative Southern supporting forces there would seem to get the upper hand. But we would threaten things like a privateering bill, which would have allowed our ships to prey on British shipping. And interestingly, one thing that seemed to keep the English in line a bit was that Lincoln and Seward never denied the rumor of an American-Russian alliance. And this possibility scared England, as Europe was always bubbling with diplomatic intrigue. Now, again, these continued issues with Britain throw a spotlight on the incredible story of Union and Southern propaganda in Europe during the war. They both, as I said, used the European media, both North and South, but they also sent a slew of representatives to go to all the countries in Europe and argue their case. And in the end, Lincoln's understanding of the press was not only better than Davis's, but also his choice of who to send over to England was better than what the South did. He sent some really interesting people abroad. They were very diverse. For example, he sent the politician Thurlow Weed. He sent Archbishop John Hughes of New York. He sent General Scott, the famous preacher Henry Ward Beecher, brother of Harriet. He sent the financier William Aspinall, a former Secretary of the Treasury, Robert Walker, as well as former slaves like Frederick Douglass. He sent them over to plead the case of the Union. And we should also never discount Lincoln's direct appeals to the people of Europe, especially to the British. He wrote letters that were published in British papers, perhaps most famously his letter to the working men of Manchester. Now, the main propaganda difficulties for Lincoln were three. First, as you may recall, in the first few years of the war, the North kept losing battles. This was not great. This allowed our opponents there to paint a picture of a weak North that was destined ultimately to lose. And many in England, like Gladstone, who was to be such an important prime minister in English history, actively encouraged intervention on the side of the South because he thought they ultimately would win. He gave a very famous speech, Gladstone did, praising Jefferson Davis. The second trouble for Lincoln in propaganda in Europe was that his main strength overseas was his appeal to European liberals. But at home, Lincoln was being forced to take actions that upset those very liberals, such as censorship of newspapers, jailing war opponents, suspending habeas corpus. So that did not help either. And finally, Lincoln's third main obstacle early in the war was his inability to use the issue of emancipation. As you know, he could not rush into emancipation given his need to keep the border states, especially Kentucky. So if we lose Kentucky, we lose the whole thing. And so he, again, brought along public opinion. That took time. And so at first he couldn't use the war as a war of liberation as a way of appealing to European liberals. Of course, he finally did promulgate the Emancipation Proclamation, which went into effect on January 1st of 1863. So Southern propaganda efforts ebbed and flowed, but after the Emancipation Proclamation, they mainly ebbed. That was not true just in England, but also in France. But the effect there was slower given the despotic nature of the Bonaparte regime. So Lincoln and his agents in France, Dayton and Bigelow, who you saw earlier, courted French liberals while also connecting as much as possible with those around Emperor Napoleon III. Now, Napoleon III is a really interesting guy. I don't know if you've ever read much about him. He was the nephew of Napoleon that we all know, right? He was a lifelong political intriguer. He had spent years trying to inspire a revolution in France. Unsuccessful. He was in prison when the revolutions of 1848 broke out in Paris. He escaped prison, made his way to Paris, where he was elected president of the new French Republic. That's not a good move, ladies and gentlemen, to put a Bonaparte in as your president. So, of course, he pretty quickly staged a coup, destroyed the Second Republic, and had himself crowned Emperor Napoleon III. With thoughts in his head of reviving his uncle's empire in Europe and the New World, he acted on our weakness during the Civil War, invading Mexico in late 1861. He asked England and Spain to join him, and he agreed to put a Habsburg monarch on the throne in Mexico City. At first, the British and Spanish joined in, but pretty quickly exited the operation, leaving only French troops. They did take Mexico City in 1863 and put Maximilian on the throne in 1864. Now, officially, we stayed neutral in this, but Lincoln, of course, wanted the Mexican Republicans to be victorious and throw out the French. So tensions remained very high with France as they consolidated their hold in Mexico. They continued to threaten recognition of the South. They allowed Confederates to build ships in France, get supplies in France, and then smuggle them through Mexico into the Confederacy. The great fear of America, Lincoln, was that France and England ultimately would join forces, recognize the South, demand a mediation, and that would be the end of the game. And then, of course, the thought was Napoleon would swoop back in and try to reclaim many of the lands of the Louisiana Purchase. So Lincoln had to walk a fine line, but of course they were sympathetic to the Mexican Republicans headed by Benito Juarez, who had been inaugurated as president of Mexico in March of 1861, the very same month that Lincoln had become our president. Juarez was a reformer who was trying to rebuild Mexico after years of civil strife, and as part of that effort, he had suspended payments of loans to foreign powers, and that had served as the pretext for the French and the English and the Spanish to invade. Lincoln respected Juarez, a respect returned in full, based in large part on the memory of Lincoln's opposition to the U.S.-Mexican War. Mexico was represented very ably in D.C. during the Civil War by Matias Romero, who had visited President-elect Lincoln in Springfield and maintained a very close relationship with the President and Mrs. Lincoln after their move to Washington. I think it's pretty funny they said that President Lincoln really liked Romero for many reasons, but especially Romero would go with Mrs. Lincoln on shopping trips. And so Abe didn't have to go with her. And so he really liked that part about Ambassador Romero as well. Now, ultimately, as the Civil War was drawing to a close, Lincoln realized that with now a massive Union army, he would have a very potent army to take action against France and Mexico if we so desired. And pressure mounted on Lincoln to do that very thing. Napoleon became very nervous. Lincoln directed Grant to mass troops on the Mexican border, and Grant responded by sending 50,000 troops to the border under General Sheridan. Grant and Sheridan gave logistical advice to the Mexican Republicans, shared intelligence with them, and lost a lot of weapons and ammunition. In one such incident, they lost 30,000 rifles that, oddly enough, were found by the Mexican Republicans. They also encouraged this is something I learned, they also encouraged our soldiers who were being discharged to sign up for service with the Mexican Republicans, of which nearly 3,000 did, including a large number of African-American soldiers. Lincoln and Grant saw this effort against the French as part of the ending of our Civil War. There were still rebels, and they feared any possible combination of the rebels with imperial forces in Mexico. Grant once said, showing how connected these two things were in their minds, Grant had said that, quote, the French invasion was so closely related to the rebellion as to be essentially part of it, unquote. Now, as that rebellion was finally ending in the United States, Lincoln and Grant poised a really mighty army on the border of Maximilian's would-be empire. With French public opinion turning against him, with the growing opposition in Mexico, with the collapse of the support of any other major power, and with these American troops on the border, Napoleon blinked and withdrew his support from Maximilian. As I'm sure you know, living here in Texas, was eventually overtaken by Mexican forces and executed in 1867. At the end of the day, Lincoln knew that French adventurism in Mexico could not survive once we regained our power to project our power. Now, getting back to the broader picture, as the war progressed, I think Lincoln and Seward's success was due to several factors. First, you cannot overestimate the power of victory. When Grant and Sherman finally started not just stemming the Confederate tide, but going on the offensive, Europeans realized, finally, the inherent strengths of the North and that they would be triumphant. Second, as we've discussed, Lincoln and his whole crew very effectively used the battle of ideas, of propaganda. Third, there was a big old dose of good old European balance of power considerations. The back and forth between and with England and France, the assumed alliance of the U.S. with Russia, tensions in Europe over things like the fate of Poland, English domestic issues, this all played into our hands. And England in particular had to decide what was more important to them, the United States or continentally their growing concerns with Russia. Now, U.S.-Russian relations were quite close in this era. We had sympathized with them in the Crimean War that they fought against England, France, and the Ottomans. Russia didn't trust England or France, and they were confronted with English support of the Polish rebellion against Russian rule. The U.S., the Tsar warned the U.S. often of English-French plotting during the Civil War, and he always refused to join in with them. Many, including Seward, thought that Russian support of America was so strong that they would fight on our side if England and France decided to intervene. And there were certainly, again, rumors of a formal secret Russian alliance, and it was bolstered by the fact that the Russian Atlantic Fleet was sent to visit New York and D.C. in 1863, and their Pacific Fleet visited San Francisco that same year. It appears there was perhaps even some discussion about putting those fleets. The Russian fleet in San Francisco even prepared to defend the city when it was threatened by a Confederate ship. So this entente, this friendship between the Russia and U.S. appears to have played a significant role in deterring the English in particular from intervention. And finally, you cannot discount the abilities of my guy, Mr. Lincoln. A man with no experience in foreign policy, had an innate understanding of diplomacy, of brinksmanship, of alignments, of language, of timing, and maybe most fundamentally of human nature. This is not to say he didn't despair at times. He had no crystal ball. But as the war ended with the North triumphant, the Union preserved, and slavery abolished, Lincoln could have been forgiving for feeling a little bit proud. He built a foreign policy establishment full of new and interesting characters from a relatively new party, even in times of peace and harmony, not an easy task. He did it in a time of civil war, when the world was betting against us, and when much of that world seemed to have a lot to gain from our defeat. Now, Jeff is the real expert on this, but I will say some scholars have seen in Lincoln the dichotomy of American foreign policy between expansionism based on our belief in American exceptionalism versus our belief in self-determination and republic governance for all. As one author put it, there's a tension between the individual conscience that Lincoln helped to shape, the focus on equality and individual liberty, versus the rise to global power that he foresaw and supported and helped to create, both by strengthening the presidency and the federal government, and by understanding at a very fundamental level the vital importance of our economic power around the globe. Lincoln, like many in his time, like Germany, Cavour in Italy, realized the importance of unifying a nation and the power inherent in unification and consolidation as opposed to continuous expansion. The vast American continent and the power inherent in our resources and in our people, he knew that a preserved union was destined to take a leading role on the world stage. As one author put it, at the end of the Civil War, America was mobilized, centralized, and ready to dominate the coming century. Lincoln was determined that it do so as a free nation, as a model of Republican government. So Lincoln, at the end, was a pragmatist, but in support of his everything revolved around saving the Union to preserve the ideas of self-government, of liberty, and of equality. His hard approach to fighting and winning the war, to making pragmatic decisions here and abroad, was based on his belief in could only be saved if the Union itself was saved. His adherence to those fundamental ideas defined and continued to make him something more of model, and that for him, independence. All that made America special flowed from those words. Oh, thank you. Please, thank you. Let's see if this works any better. Hello, hello. All right, good. There you go. I'll start again. I'm just joking. So he would say everything goes back to the Declaration. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with the rights of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. So a nation of free men and women, free labor, equality, justice, representative government, the rule of impartial law. These were universal ideas that, in Lincoln's eyes, came alive in America, which was then a beacon to the world and an example for that world to follow. He knew that the world was watching the American experiment. He called it the last best hope of man. Now, Jeff knows that any presentation I give, I have to have a picture of Henry Clay in it, so I finally have done that. As a young man, Lincoln had seen revolutions in Europe break out, especially in 1848, fueled by that desire for freedom and democracy, those fundamental American ideas. Many of those revolutions had failed, but they showed the power of those ideas. And Lincoln's political idol, Henry Clay, was an ardent supporter of freedom movements around the world, expressing his support, for example, for Greek independence from the Ottomans and for the liberation movements in South America. Lincoln saw those mid-century revolutions as part of the general cause of freedom and thought that America had a special international mission in the eternal fight of liberty versus tyranny. During his time in the Illinois legislature and in the U.S. Congress, Lincoln expressed his sympathies for Irish, French, German, and Hungarian revolutionaries. He was even tasked by the Illinois legislature with helping to draft a resolution supporting Kossuth, the great Hungarian revolutionary who was then touring America. In his annual message to Congress in 1862, as I said earlier, he referred to America as the last hope of man. We were the model of democracy. We were alone in the world as a republic. Many had said that republics, especially large ones, could not succeed in the long term. Lincoln believed differently. He thought if we were just true to our ideas, once the Union was preserved, a strong America could show the world how to move into a democratic future. Hence, perhaps his most famous statement in this regard at the dedication of the cemetery in Gettysburg. He told us we were fighting, why we were fighting. We were preserving, for us and for all mankind, government of, by, and for the people. Now, he made use of this idea during his presidency, standing first in the ideal of Republican representative government and then adding emancipation, a very potent combination around the world. Reformers and radicals from around the world would write to him during his presidency. Garibaldi, the great Italian revolutionary, wrote to him and said, "America is the teacher of liberty to our fathers." Lincoln had seen the power of these ideas all of his life, as illustrated perhaps best by the flood of immigrants that had come to our shores in the early and middle 19th century. Already, we were the refuge of those who did not have liberty and opportunity in their homelands. For example, after the failures of the revolutions of 1848 in the German states, a flood of German immigrants came to America, especially to Illinois. And he worked a lot with those German immigrants when he was a politician in Illinois. In his last annual address to Congress, Lincoln noted the importance of immigration, saying America was a haven to the world. He admired immigrants. He saw why they were coming. And realist that he was, he saw them as a potent political force and a potent fighting force. This is something I didn't realize. Fully 1/3 of Union forces in the Civil War were foreign-born. That was a fact I did not know. When Lincoln died at the hands of the murderer in Ford's Theater, reaction to his death around the world was overwhelming. We have some of the pieces in our archives that survive from people around the world, including heads of state, sending their condolences. The outpourings of grief from around the globe were simply unprecedented. A man who had been so reviled at times in this nation, who had almost lost his bid for re-election, and almost wasn't even renominated by his own party for re-election, had become, with the winning of the war, the passage of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, the passage of the 13th Amendment, and now with his horrific death, he had become an instant icon. A man, yes, but a symbol as well. Perhaps best summed up by a citizen in a small town in Sicily who wrote, saying, "Abraham Lincoln was not yours only. He was also ours, because he was a brother whose great mind and fearless conscience guided a people to union and courageously uprooted slavery." Unquote. The gatherings across Europe to mourn his passing were indeed the largest of the era. The compendium of foreign condolences compiled by the State Department ran to 800 pages, with messages not just from Europe, but also from Asia and South America and Africa. Ever since then, freedom fighters around the globe have embraced Lincoln as their hero. He showed how a man of the people, emboldened with ideas, could change the world, and how a republic formed by free men, free labor, free ideas could not only survive, but thrive. He stood for emancipation, democracy, economic modernization, humanitarianism, the self-made man. He was the model of that. He's been used by reformers and revolutionaries, sometimes by opposing sides in conflicts. So you see him invoked by Japanese modernizers, by Uruguayan reformers, by Germans in the Weimar Republic, by British campaigners for expanding the suffrage, by both Irish nationalists and Irish unionists, Russians, Spaniards, by anti-colonial leaders in Africa and Asia after World War II. Gandhi once said that he lived his life to put into effect Lincoln's famous saying. Lincoln had said this at the Cooper Union speech before the presidency, where he ended the speech by saying, "Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it." I've heard so many stories of Lincoln's presence in the world today. Every year, people from at least 50 different countries come to our museum in Springfield. We get almost 300,000 people a year through our galleries in Springfield, Illinois. It's a kind of a pilgrimage for them. They've erected statues around the world of the Great Emancipator. My quick research has found that they have statues in Manchester and London, of course, in England, as well as in Scotland. There are several in Mexico, Norway, Austria, France, Guatemala, Israel, Ecuador, Russia, and even Cuba. Admittedly, each society and culture identifies and absorbs Lincoln and his ideas in its own way, but remarkably, he appeals across cultural and historical divides. So you have individuals as diverse as Nehru in India, Tsar Alexander II, Otto von Bismarck in Germany, and Karl Marx, who all pointed to Lincoln as some type of ideal. Tolstoy called him a Christ in miniature, a humanitarian as broad as the world. The outgoing Secretary of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, visited us at the end of 2016. He had left office and was returning to his native South Korea. But on his way home, he came to Springfield. He said it was on his bucket list to come see us. As we walked through the galleries, we entered an area that's dedicated to the Gettysburg Address. And when we got to that area, he stopped, and he looked at me, and he recited the entire Gettysburg Address from memory. He had learned it, he said, as a small boy in Korea, and he forever not only remembered the words, but the ideas behind them. It was a really moving moment for all of us. That is the Lincoln who still lives in the world today, and I think we're all much, much the better for it. So thank you all so much for having me here this evening, and please come see us in Springfield. Thank you. Thank you.
Alan has deigned to offer some responses to your questions.
There'd be no comment usually, but go ahead. That's fine.
He'd also be perfectly happy to comment on Illinois politics.
I will not.
And if you would, please wait for the microphone so we can record your words for posterity.
One down here in the front.
Oh, do I get the first question? Okay.
There you go. Yes, sir.
Well, my question doesn't really apply so much to foreign policy, but I have to ask this because you're here, and you're probably the best person to ask.
Okay.
Is it correct that Lincoln approved the execution of some 30 Native Americans? And if so, why?
30 who?
Native Americans,
I do
Indians.
not know. I do not know. I have to learn that story. I will look into that.
Okay, thank you.
There you go.
Question?
I will say one thing. Since I started this job almost 2 years ago, it is amazing to me how complex the story of Lincoln is and how much has been written about him. I joked I was going to read up on Lincoln when I got there. I've read all my life on Lincoln, but I think there's about 4 or 5 books that come out every hour about him. I mean, he's endlessly fascinating to people, but I've learned a lot. I learned a lot about foreign policy preparing for tonight. I'm doing another speech on Lincoln and the founders. I'm learning more and more. One thing I will say is that one thing I tried to take special care to show is that he sometimes didn't always do the right thing. He was a human being. He would make mistakes, right? So I think sometimes we put Washington and Lincoln up on this pedestal where they're not almost seen as human beings. But they most definitely were. But I think he always tried to do his best, and he had the right ideas in mind. But trying to get from A to B was not always clear. We look back now with historical hindsight and say, well, obviously you should do this and this. But he had no such advantage. Yes, sir.
Well, actually, that kind of segues into my question is, Lincoln personally, as a husband, as a father,
Yeah.
as a friend, what, and I'm reading, again,
Yeah.
like you, there's a book every week that seems.
Yeah.
But most recently I heard he, suffered health-wise from depression and those kind of things.
Well, he
Just-
did. He did, yeah.
Yeah.
So, that's one thing I've learned. I've read a lot about his battles with depression.
Right.
And they started as a young man, and they were it's very true.
Yeah.
Sometimes his friends worried that he may take his own life, and actually took his knife away from him a couple times. And he would go into these terrible bouts, but he learned over time how to live with it and to channel it in a way. And hard work and applied work was one way he dealt with it. So it's a great book, I think, by it's called Lincoln's Melancholy. Can't remember the author. I can never remember authors. Thank you, Shank, Joshua Shank. Really, really good book on that. But I mean, other things. He was a great father. He was not a disciplinarian at all. He let the kids get away with murder, essentially, and married in like that. When you come to our museum, you'll see we recreated his law office, and it's a mess. I mean, and he's on the couch reading a newspaper, and the kids are throwing like things around the office because Herndon and others would complain mightily that he didn't control them at all. He was a very forgiving father, a very loving father, and a good husband to marry. They would have their fights, but at the end of the day, they had a deep love for one another. So yeah, so many things. His relationship with religion is something to look at. As a young man, he was kind of entranced with Thomas Paine and was called by some in New Salem the village atheist. But over time, you see that discussion with God in a way. And there was a great reverend at the church we're going to, First Presbyterian in Springfield, that talked to him and helped bring him along, where you see an evolution in his religious thought. And so by the time you get to the second inaugural is in large part a sermon. And it's telling America this is happening as payment for your sins, the sins of slavery. Right? So it's very interesting to look at that evolution. So in every way, he's an interesting man. Oh, you want to get the microphone down?
You had mentioned his use of language and
Yes.
being self-taught. His reading of Shakespeare, for example,
Yes.
and the language that he used in the Gettysburg Address
That's right.
is derivative in some ways from it. But did he have others that he conversed with, that he, in his readings, back when he was in Illinois and
Right.
becoming a young lawyer?
I think it's hard to overestimate the effect of Shakespeare. That was a very important influence in his reading of Shakespeare. He loved also to go to the theater, but also the Bible. And you can see, again, even when he maybe didn't accept the religious part of that, the phraseology, the language of the Bible, and you see that coming out in a lot of his writing. So he would read whatever he could get his hands on, but I think particularly those two had a great impact on the style that you see in his writing, for sure. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I don't have a question, but I do have a testimonial. We've traveled quite a bit, but I have never enjoyed any trip more than when we went to Springfield and all of the Lincoln Territory. Your presidential library is phenomenal.
Well, thank you so much.
I
That
just
does my
urge
heart good.
everyone
Thank you.
to go. It is
Thank you.
fantastic.
Thank you. I'm going to tape you later for our Facebook page. All right. All right. Thank you. I see one down here, guys.
You noted a little while ago that fundamentally the struggle of the Civil War was between an aristocracy and a democratic republic.
Yeah.
And the defeat of the South, it seemed, was the defeat of the aristocracy. In light of recent history,
Yeah.
Are we learning that that battle will have to be fought and refought and refought again?
So I think it was the beginning, and it was obviously a major milestone. But I think Lincoln himself, if he were alive today, would say it continues, right? So obviously even the civil rights movements of the 60s were, again, a major milestone, but it continues. So, and Jeff can tell me more about this, but there's studies of freedom, and Jeff and I have had this debate and discussion a lot about what does freedom mean? How do you define freedom, right? And a lot of people would say the original American conception of freedom was about kind of a negative, so what the government can't do to you, right? And then it started to evolve of what should the government be able to support in helping, so protecting things like your civil rights, right? So it's interesting evolution we see, and we kind of see that in some ways hitting a new plateau with Lincoln, but certainly not ending. So I think he would see it as a continuing process. Though I do think, Jeff and I had this discussion earlier today, if you miraculously brought him back today, what would he think about racial relations in the United States? And as difficult as those are, as I know we're still trying to make progress, you would have to say he would say it's amazing. I mean, the change from his time to now, seeing that there has been great progress made, but we're not there yet. Right? And if I could bring him back also, I'd say, help me fundraise a little bit while you're here, sir. That'd be great. That'd be the largest presidential library endowment on the planet. It'd be great. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Do you have a favorite piece in your library and museum that you just go to sometimes and think about?
I'll tell you a couple. One, I mean, this might be too easy. The first one, the Gettysburg Address. When you realize he wrote this, his hand. It's the first time we think that he wrote the words "under God" in it. By the way, he was asked by Everett, the main speaker that day. After that, he was asked to write it out again. We think the original copy, when he left the stage, he handed it to a reporter. So no one really knows where that is, right? So he was asked several times afterwards to write it out again. We think this is the first time he put "under God" in the text. But to see that, to realize that he wrote those words, when we give some of our guests the special vault tour and show them that, many of them will cry when they see it. It's just very moving. The other things are different things of that you wouldn't think about, the grave robbers' tools. There's a letter when Lincoln's father, Thomas, was dying. They were not close. They had a difficult relationship. He was very close to his stepmother, who was like an angel to him. But his father, you'll get historians debating that. Of course, they debate everything about Lincoln. But most will say they didn't particularly care for one another. And Lincoln gets a letter saying, your father's dying. You need to come see him. And it's just down the road near Decatur, Illinois, not too far away. And Lincoln writes back and says, I'm not going to come. It'd be more painful for both of us for me to be there than not. Telling him to put his trust in God. And that was it. Just so, I mean, again, this man has it's such a complex personality. And you wish you could go back and say, tell me about that, But we don't have that ability.
I just wanted to say that I had the wonderful opportunity, thanks to Alan, to go into that vault, and you wouldn't believe the stuff I stole. But it is, first of all, true that when you hold Lincoln's copy of the Gettysburg Address in your hand, it's really hard not to tear up. But the artifact, which I found most amazing, was Lincoln's shaving mirror.
Yeah.
And you stare into that mirror, and you realize this is the same mirror that he had stared in. Obviously, he didn't shave every day. But I think that really, for me, it epitomizes what is so fascinating about Lincoln, that we think of him, unlike Washington in many ways, we think of Lincoln as a human being, that we can picture him shaving. We picture his frailties. And there's no particular question there, but just that it's amazing
true,
that's I think, why people relate to him in some way.
I love that, too. We also have the key to his house. And the nameplate that used to be on his house, Lincoln, which if you go there now to the Park Service home, they still have it. They'll tell you that's the original. It's not. It kept on getting, they were afraid it was going to get stolen, so they put up a replica, and it keeps getting stolen, but we have the original, safe and sound. Yes, ma'am.
In answer to the first question, that was the Dakota War of 1862.
Yeah.
And Lincoln did
But
approve
then he
with
also
regret.
he pardoned a bunch.
He
as
commuted
well.
more than he approved.
Yes,
But
yes.
there were something like 34 that
Yes.
were hung, and it was a fight over land. I mean, we were stealing the Indians' land.
Yeah.
And yet we had wanted to give it to the soldiers who were retiring from the Army, that, because we couldn't afford to pay them, we could give them land,
Yeah.
somebody else's
I-
land, but that's.
And I had heard that I didn't want to comment because
Yeah.
I'm still learning things,
Yeah.
but he had commuted a good number. And that's
a
also when
huge
you,
number he commuted.
when you look at him, when people would execute soldiers who had deserted or fallen asleep on duty or whatever, he commuted so many of those.
Yeah.
He said, give them another chance.
But
It's
he
a
was
young man, right?
actually encouraged to hang more at another time, and he said something to the effect that I can't afford to hang any more for a vote.
Right,
So
right.
he felt bad about it.
Yeah, yeah. This is a man, when you look at that personality again, he was a poet. He loved to read and write poetry. He could be extremely sympathetic. He hated any cruelty to animals. He never hunted or fished. I mean, I think he fished, but he didn't hunt. But at the same time, tough as nails. And when you get into the war, you realize he was one of the few who realized early on it was a total war, not a war of maneuver, trying to maneuver around. You had to utterly destroy the opposing army. And after was it Shiloh or one of the early battles where there were a huge number of casualties, and Grant's detractors tried to get Lincoln to fire him. And Lincoln said, I can't spare this man, he fights. And he realized that that's what it was going to take, sadly, was a lot of blood to win the war. Yes, sir, Talmadge. I quake with anticipation as to what this question will be.
What is your favorite biography of Abraham Lincoln?
There's so many. David Donald's.
Give your top 2 or 3 then.
Well, David Donald's was a great one. I like Ron White's A. Lincoln. Ron is a great writer. Both his biography of Lincoln and his book about the second inaugural, Lincoln's Greatest Speech, fantastic. So those are good starting points, and then there are about 1 million more. Amy, the great curator of the Bush Library Museum.
So it's my understanding that you have removed John Wilkes Booth from the entrance of your exhibit.
Yes.
Are you or are you not trying to revise history?
Amy knows this has been a bit of a source of controversy. So I go in, I start as director there, and in our plaza, you see that Lincoln family there? That's in our plaza, and there's behind it's the facade of the White House, very striking, great photo ops. In the front of the White House, we have Ulysses Grant, McClellan, which I don't know why he's there, Sojourner Truth, and Frederick Douglass. But then lurking next to them was John Wilkes Booth. And I thought, that's weird that we have the assassin there. I thought, well, I'm a new guy here. I'm not going to say anything. So about 3 or 4 months later, it still irked me every time I would see people getting their photo with the Lincoln family, and John Wilkes Booth was photobombing them essentially behind every. Like, why? So I went to our state historian who works for me, and I said, why is Booth there? And he said, hell if I know, I'd like to get him out of there. So I'm like, okay. So I removed him. And it was like I dropped a hydrogen bomb in Springfield. People were very upset with me, at least some people. Some people said, great move. He should never have been there. Other people said I was destroying history and all this other stuff. And what I said to them was, I think having Booth there either trivializes him, that crazy scamp, or it glorifies him in some way. I'm not going to do either one. We have part of the museum, a big part of the museum, that talks about the assassination. We have a recreation of Booth sneaking in to shoot the president. We have a whole thing about the funeral train and the funeral. All this. We have Booth artifacts we're going to put out. We have a lot of Booth artifacts from both him and his family. That's the right place to do it. Not in the plaza where we're saying, welcome to the library. I said you would not expect to walk in the Kennedy Library and see Oswald staring at you. I'm not going to do it here. And I think overall, 75% of the people have been happy, 25% like, what are you doing? But I will say that shows their passion for the place. That's good. And when I try to explain it to them, usually they're okay. Except for Amy, who's still very bitter about it.
Well, I'm gonna take the opportunity of holding the mic to ask one final question. I'm still of mixed minds about the central essence of Lincoln's foreign policy. It was obviously he thought the United States should be an example to the world. He said that we were the last hope of the world numerous times. how far did that extend, not just to being an example, but to being a proponent of American democracy?
He thought that we should be a model, but not interventionist. So if that's the question you're asking, he would not be a proponent of saying, let's create democracy somewhere by intervening. He said the model should do it. So you see a successful, economically vibrant America that's united, that's standing up for these ideas, that model will catch fire and other people will emulate it.
Works for me.
There you go.
Well, if you'd all join me, please, in thanking our good friend Alan Lowe.
Thank you. Thank you.